welcome to this session within India Global Forum. As we reimagine the relationship between the UK and India, we're also reimagining the global economy and the great pivot here. We are going to introduce our panel. Why don't we do that now?
So in order, it's Shamik, Dhar, Chief Economist at BNY Investment Management.
We've got Lord Gadhia, Lord Jitesh Gadhia from the House of Lords. Thanks very much for coming.
Sanjay, Nayar, Senior Advisor, KKR India, third along.
And we've also got Sanjeev, Sanyal, Economic Advisor to Prime Minister in the Government of India. Welcome.
And this is a first, by the way, ED and I moderating a panel together. So
it's a historic moment.
There's room for craziness, and we might get you guys involved as well. So as it's the penultimate panel, let's have some fun.
Why not?
Let's kick it off then.
Let's kick it off. So, okay, I would say, you know, we've got a global tornado of crises at the moment, right? I was just speaking about it with Bill Winters. We have food prices are still an issue. We have rising oil prices. They don't seem to be coming down. We have a war in Europe. I wonder if you could just paint the picture. We've got inflation, concerns about a recession. We heard Standard Chartered thinks there will be a recession. Paint the picture for me. How do you see the situation? What's most on your mind?
Shall I kick off?
Kick off.
We'll go down the road.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, look, it's hard to disagree with much that Bill Winters says. It always is. So I'm not going to focus on the next 6 to 9 months. I think the bigger issue, both for the UK and India, really comes out in the next couple of years. And there are a couple of big pivots going on, which are going to be with us for a while. First off is the end of easy money. You know, we've been used ever since the financial crisis to a world in which essentially markets could price things according to where the discount rate was going, and the discount rate was at zero. So essentially all boats were being lifted. Now I think we're going into an era where that's no longer going to be the case, and allocating capital becomes a skilled task again. And therefore, you know, countries like India and the UK need to position themselves to attract that capital using their policies properly. The second big pivot in my mind, and this is a 10, 20, 30-year pivot, is that we are moving into a world which is very unfamiliar geopolitically. So we're moving back to a kind of late 19th century world, it seems to me, where you're talking about great power rivalry as opposed to hegemony or some kind of, sort of standoff between the superpowers. Obviously, you'll have an element of that, a large element of that with US and China, but at the end of the day, for the UK and India, it's how do you position yourself in that world in which the great powers are facing off against each other more dramatically, and that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and Lord Gadhia, we'll sort of come to that angle, the positioning of UK-India a little bit later, but chew on a few of those themes. Easy money, allocating capital, this environment, unfamiliar geopolitically, throw your hat into the ring. What more can you add to that? What are your fears and concerns in this
what keeps
tornado?
You up at night?
Yeah.
Well, look, the storm clouds are gathering. I thought Bill was being, I think, actually relatively glass half full. His fellow CEO on Wall Street, Jamie Dimon, who's the great survivor, recently said that, you know, unprecedented risks are combining with unpredictable consequences. And I think there is a sort of a sense that we're at the lull before the real storm. And that's certainly what I feel. Anybody who has sort of memory of the financial crisis, I'm sure it's ingrained on all of us. I sort of feel we are approaching the sort of August 2007 moment rather than the September 2008, i.e. things are going to become difficult. You look at, say, the financing markets, and I'm sure Sanjay can comment on this. You know, certainly, ostensibly, they're closed. Certainly in Europe, you've just seen a big transaction that Walgreens Boots Alliance was going to launch to sell boots. That's been pulled. There are a lot of other transactions being pulled in the market. So I do think that we're at the sort of moment where we don't quite know what the trajectory is going to be, but we fear. So it's almost this oscillation in markets between fear and greed, which are never great emotions.
Interesting, Sanjay. He set you up there. Financing getting tight across Europe, but we had so many entrepreneurs and actually financiers from India saying it's quite a different picture in India. Where do you stand on that? Where does KKR stand on that?
Well, I won't comment on behalf of KKR, but I would say generally India is actually, as we were discussing in the morning, India has taken the bitter medicine on the financial sector about a couple of years ago after the 2018 crisis. So actually India from a financial sector point of view is in pretty good shape, but that's the formal banking sector. That's in pretty good shape. So we don't talk much about NPAs and all that. I think the larger issue for our country and in the context of all the global turmoil is that we need to be a lot more now independent and not just dependent upon foreign flows for everything, right? And frankly, we are going to remain quite dependent for energy imports for some time because we can't overnight become energy self-reliant. And besides importing so much inflation, we have to worry about how do you get India into a position when globalization is reducing, even the flow of global capital is going to shrink. I think the biggest thing for us is a couple of pivots or vectors we need to focus on for the financing side. One, we have to harness the local pools of capital. I think it's going to be absolutely critical to fast track how to get the local pools of capital come back into the real markets, okay? Not just go into government bonds, which of course is priority number one from the government's point of view, but from the private point of view, you need to harness local capital. And there are lots and lots of reasons and committees and tax issues we need to sort out. So that's number one. I think number two, we will have to develop business models in the country that are locally built at local pricing for local citizens. I think the bringing global models and imposing into India worked. It will work, but I think that's a second big pivot. And I think thirdly, frankly, the government has to find rapidly sources of financing. How much deficit can they keep supporting and growing? So asset monetization plan, which this government has very well designed, very well structured, needs to be fast tracked big time to get foreign capital into asset monetization. And I don't mean privatizations, but just infra operating assets. It's a fantastic plan. And if anybody can do it, this government can do it. I think we need to fast track that. So these three things. One, the government will have to fast track raising resources through creative, well-structured means. Business models have to become a lot more locally built, local technologies there. E-commerce is a massive new pivot in India. And thirdly, we will have to make sure that we become a lot more self-reliant with local capital from the savings of the people, which again is not very high, but the fact is that needs to be harnessed and taken out in a frictionless way and brought into the real sector.
Lots of advice to chew on if you're the government, and it's great because we've got the economic advisor to the Prime Minister here. How much of this do you agree with, Sanjeev? What advice are you passing on to the Prime Minister, and are you using terms like tornadoes and avalanches and sort of end of world?
Grim and grimmer.
Or are you toning it down for the Prime Minister?
I think you have got to see it in a larger historical context. So first of all, the fact that there's change and uncertainty, do remember that is always true. If you went back 10 years ago, you would have been sitting here discussing the global financial crisis. And we went back another 10 years back, we were talking about the tech bubble burst and the Asian financial crisis. In fact, we went another 10 years back, you were discussing the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So I think we've got to be a little careful about getting swayed too much by what is happening now. There's never a perfect time. And so I think, therefore, what we need to do is when we use a word like pivot, we really need to think about what is genuinely discontinuous change. Because if you don't pay attention to those big discontinuous changes and get thrown off by the noise in some ways, then you will miss the big picture. And in that context, let me lay out a few things which I think are big pivot changes. First big pivot change is that we are in a very fluid geopolitical situation. And the last time we were in this kind of situation was before the First World War. Because since then, we have either had a duopoly and then there was a monopoly. But this free market of geopolitics is actually quite dangerous, as we found out in the First World War. That doesn't mean that it immediately leads to a war or something like that. Do remember that this free market situation lasted actually for quite some time before the First World War. Between 1870 and 1914, there was actually a period of prosperity when there were multiple world powers vying for power. So this kind of situation can last quite some time, but it is ultimately can lead to very bad outcomes. And so don't be fooled by periods of relative peace, because it can go wrong, and we do need to create ways of getting around that. But creating complex alliances, by the way, may not necessarily get you out of trouble, as again we found out in the First World War. So that is one big pivot. The second major pivot is, whether it's for climate reasons or simply because of geopolitics or economic reasons, there will be a pivot away from our reliance on various kinds of hydrocarbons. Now, as I said, most of the conversation happens, I think at least recently used to happen, relating to climate. But in fact, as much of the world has discovered, there are serious geopolitical connotations of this, again linked to my first point, and Europe has discovered that quite well this year, that what happens if you end up having an economy that's completely dependent on imports. The third thing, which is again linked to this, is the issue of creating supply chains that are not only thinking about a peculiar kind of efficiency. So we have got to think about more the resilience of the system, not just supply chains, but of the global economy has suddenly come back in fashion. So from just in time, we've begun to think just in case. And that is an important way of thinking. Now, in all of these things, India has a role to play. We in India do want to move away to other kinds of energy sources, not just because of our role of our commitments in the Paris Agreement, but because as a country we simply are not being endowed with a large amount of hydrocarbons, and consequently from a purely economic perspective we want to move on to some other sources of energy. How we do that, how the transition is, of course, is one issue. Similar thing, we want to insert ourselves as an important part of the global supply chain, especially in a context where people are moving out of, let's say, China, for both geopolitical reasons, but also for diversification reasons. So all of that is a context in which this pivot that you talked about needs to be thought about.
Interesting. I wonder, Shamik, if you want to build on anything that you've heard there from Sanjeev. And one of the things that you mentioned was the pivot towards a carbon neutral economy. Now, that requires financing, and we know that the financing needs to move from Western countries to Eastern countries. India is going to be a very large part of that because of the clean tech revolution already going on. But I wonder if you can put that in context for us. We know it's something like 4 trillion a year needs to move from the West to the East, or from the richer countries to lower and middle income countries. Give us some context from BNY.
Yeah, I think your number is really important. It is a huge challenge. I mean, we estimate roughly between now and over the next 30 years about $100 trillion dollars worth of investment. Now, 100 trillion is a big number, right? It's roughly the size of the world economy in any one year. The good news is we've got 30 years to do it. There's more good news in the sense that a lot of that 100 trillion will come in the form of replacement investment. So dirty capital will wear out, and we'll replace it with clean. However, the challenge, I think, for India, UK, but also a number of Western countries, is that there will be a rump of about 20 to 30 trillion dollars worth of fixed assets that, frankly, will have to be retired early, before the end of their economically useful life. And that's going to be a huge, in this geopolitical context, that's going to be a huge political challenge, let alone an economic one, in countries that are maybe facing issues in terms of getting to full employment and that sort of thing. So we need, frankly, an active plan in a number of countries. It's really encouraging to hear that, it seems to me the government of India is addressing this question head on. I think those questions are coming much more to the fore in the UK, but I think everywhere could do with, frankly, a lot more coordination and a bit more sort of planning.
Let's talk about the coordination and planning, Lord Gadhia. What are you seeing from the UK perspective?
Well, look, I think, what Sanjeev described was more of a pirouette than a pivot. But I definitely take the point on hydrocarbons. So, look, I think there is a very clear mission here to accelerate investments, particularly in areas where we're developing an amazing competitive advantage, like offshore wind, where the Prime Minister is very well known for saying that we're going to be the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, and there is a fivefold increase in our capacity coming up in the years to come. Sadly, we're not endowed with enough sun to do the same with solar, but on nuclear, there's also a very interesting opportunity to frankly catch up when decisions should have been made earlier. So I do think that the hydrocarbon economy will help.
Talk us through the nuclear question, because it's a really important one. And the last time I interviewed somebody at MIT who uses a model looking at the changes we need to make in order to reach net zero by 2040, 2050. You can't do it without nuclear, but there still seems such a large resistance in many parts of the world. Do you think that argument will be won?
Look, I think we, through experience, I think we are tackling some of the historic barriers. And I think one of them obviously has been the risks around, blowouts, around the tail end of nuclear, which is the decommissioning, and other not just costs but risks. And that has become, I think, more manageable. I see even the Japanese have put nuclear potentially back on the table. And remember, there is innovation in the technologies. So I sit on the board of Rolls-Royce, which is developing a small modular reactor. And I think some of those solutions will probably be better suited rather than the big, 3.5 gigawatt huge mega plants, which can often run ahead of schedule, both in terms of time and costs. And of course, the funding is also key to these things. Yeah. And in the UK, we originally started with something called the contracts for difference, which meant that the risk allocation was a particular way. We're now exploring something called the regulated asset-based RAB models, which could also help fund these plants.
Sanjay, can we move it on? Because, gosh, time flies when you're having fun. 9 minutes to go. UK, India, Reimagine, 75. Let's rein it back to this on the penultimate panel. Given everything we've said, how important are close alliances, the living bridge, this wonderful relationship that we've been talking about again and again and again? How important is this in this very uncertain, the words you've been using, very bad outcomes you use. This is a very scary geopolitical backdrop. How important is it to have this bilateral?
Began by saying nothing is that bad.
Yeah. How important is it to have this close bilateral tie between the two nations?
I think it's pretty natural for these two countries, given the history, given the democracies. And I think today morning we discussed at the breakfast that there's one area that there can be a lot more working together, and I think we should think about that and see what the next steps are, is on the whole IT, electronics, digital economy side. There are a lot of things that the UK has done really well, especially when you look at the fintech space. That's a space where our country needs a lot more fintech models to be implemented, especially to increase financial inclusion, which is a stated mission by pretty much everyone, and driven by this government, who has made availability of amazing paradigms like UPI and open networks, and really driven the digital economy. But then, we are pretty heavy on regulations, licensing, inspections, and I think UK has followed a fantastic model of leaving things alone, a little bit more light touch, a bit more self-compliant, self-declaration. So a few things to learn on that front. I think we spoke about in the morning about digital identity, something that again could be very interestingly, collaborated between the two countries. And then we heard some entrepreneurs. I think it's a great idea to use the base and the cost advantage in India. Well, it's a question mark how much cost advantage we have, but the talent and cost advantage and some of the talent that you have here. And a lot of companies today morning were saying they have bases in the UK and a lot of European designers and engineers sitting here, as well as leveraging the India presence. So a lot to do, I think, if we just put our mind to what can be done rather than just the normal trade and IT services. You go to the next level of trying to build a digital economy, which India is desperately doing and actually doing a really good job. I think there's a lot to learn from each other.
Interesting. Sanjeev, do you want to build on that? There seem to be, we're building this digital economy. There's a lot of connections already between the UK and India that are doing that. There is some concern, however, that we've just heard from Sanjay around too much regulation, bureaucracy, and of course that is what business always reigns against, right? Rebels against. So talk to us about what you think needs to be done, or what you're advising the government to do on this.
So we take ease of doing business very seriously. We are aware of India's reputation of over-regulation, and in the last few years, through this COVID this crisis, actually the Indian government put in a huge amount of effort into getting rid of all kinds of useless regulations. So India was actually one of the very few countries in the world which put in a lot of effort onto the supply side of the economy rather than just do demand management through the last few years. So, whether it's the drone sector which we threw open, the geospatial satellites and space, all these defense, many of these sectors have been essentially thrown open in India. And so, as I said, if anybody in the audience has other sectors they feel as over-regulated, please bring it to me. We will be very pleased to explore that. Meanwhile, as far as the UK-India relationship is concerned, as you all know, we are exploring the free trade agreement, and discussions are quite advanced, and hopefully we will be able to put that together before the end of the year. So I think, of course, the world is always uncertain, and there are these sort of concerns and possible risks of bad things happening, which are always there. But at the same time, as far as the Indian government is concerned and our relationship with the UK is concerned, we are aware of these, and we are putting together what we can in order to sort of do the best that we can given what we know, whether it's building geopolitical alliances such as the Quad, or working quite hard to try and get more and more supply chains passed through India in multiple ways, and the FTA is part of that, or working very hard on this pivoting away from hydrocarbons. Incidentally, on nuclear, we have very similar issues as Jitesh just pointed out. But of course, technology is changing even in this field. It's not a static technology, whether it's there's a lot of interesting new things that have happened in the last few years in cold fusion, for example. In fact, if that breaks through, that would be fabulous, because that would very quickly generate enormous energy on unimaginable scales very cheaply. But of course, we will continue with exploring solar, which we in India are not given too much wind, but we do have solar, a lot of that, and we are already exploiting it.
Let's do it. Let's do some quick fire rounds,
Why
shall
not?
we? I'll fire a question at you all, very quick answers, and we'll do a bit of that, Edie and me, versus you two. What keeps you awake at night? Number one economic or geopolitical worry from all of you. Let's go. Shamik.
Much higher rates than anyone's expecting.
Like what? How high are you worried about?
5 to 6%.
Really, in the US, 5 to 6%.
Yeah.
What damage does that do to the
I
economy?
think the markets aren't priced for that. It may be that that's what's required to squeeze inflation out of the system, and we're not really prepared for it. Everyone's asking me, are we at the equity market bottom at the moment? If we get to that sort of level, then no, we're a long way.
How much more down? If we get to 6% rates, does
I'm not saying we will, but you asked me what I'm scared about, and that's
If
what
we
I'm
get
scared
to
about. I think
6%
6% out,
rates-
you're easily another 15 to 20%.
Or from the S&P? Wow.
Now.
So I would say another sort of, it's maybe not even a black swan or grey swan event like an escape variant exactly occurring at the time that we're trying to tame inflation.
Right.
That would be the number one thing.
Double punch.
Okay, Sanjay, what about you? What keeps you awake?
I think I look from an India perspective only. I think I just find that sticky supply side inflation, sticky, just doesn't come off, and consumption and growth comes off. I think the combination of that really worries me because frankly our economy is driven primarily by consumption. Yes, a lot of investment by the government, but not by the private sector. So I really worry that if the supply side continues to be kind of creating sticky inflation, which is what we are facing, then I think, and of course with importing energy and increasing energy prices, but then having low growth, I think that's a so-called bad scenario for India, and that keeps me awake.
What about you, Sanjeev? What thoughts? What's the biggest number one concern?
What stops you from sleeping?
Oh, I sleep real well. But I would say that certainly oil prices remaining at these levels for a prolonged period of time, that's obviously we are an oil importer and there's very little we can really do about this. So that is something that will hurt us, but also the world economy. So that is certainly something that is a concern, elevated energy prices for a prolonged period of time.
Interesting. What about biggest underrated economic opportunity? Shamik, what do you think?
Crumbs, I always have to go first. Actually, it's better than going last. So I think, actually, I'm not sure markets have still priced in just how big the demographic transition is going to be over the next 10, 15 years, what that means for real interest rates, but importantly, what it means for where the real sources of demand, which is what keeps the world economy going, are going to come from in 10 to 15 years' time. And frankly, India is extremely well positioned for that. But any country with a large youthful population is going to see, I think, a big pickup in its economic performance, so long as things are handled properly. So I think that's currently still underpriced by the markets.
Gadhia?
Maybe the converse of that, given the demographics, is I think the life sciences sector has a lot more to go. So it's underpinned by demographics, but it's also underpinned by discontinuities in breakthrough research, innovation, technology.
What part of life sciences would you point
genomics
to? Genomics
is an incredible area, personalized medicine, early cancer diagnosis, detection. There is a whole slew of things. And again, actually, talking about UK-India, this is a corridor where actually we could do a lot more.
Okay, Sanjay, what about you? Show us what's on your mind, what's in your book, what's underpriced by the rest of the market that you already know about?
I think, again, from an India concept, just more efficiency in the economy, and something that the government is driving a lot is this whole thing called the Gati Shakti program, just linking the various infrastructures that we have and multimodal transport. I think it can be a big game changer, even within the context of our constraints. Just having better logistics, better connectivity, could really improve the efficiency and the productivity, which are two things that do create a bit of a negative draft for us. So I think those are simple things that are being implemented. If done well, I think they can be pretty big game changers. But I know you're pretty involved with that, so maybe you want to comment.
Throw your bit into that.
So I think the biggest opportunity being underestimated by global markets is India. I think the point is that many of the things people think about India are increasingly either not a problem or becoming a positive in our favor. For example, much of our infrastructure bottlenecks, with the exception of urban infrastructure, which still needs to be fixed, but whether it's our highways or our telecommunications or our airports, much of this is now no longer a constraint to our economic growth. Similarly, demographics, which used to be, rapidly growing population, which was a constraint, has now stabilized. Our birth rates have fallen to levels where our population is essentially going to stabilize quite quickly, but it will now transition from people being below working age to into working age, and we will replace the China in the course of the next few years as the world's largest workforce. So that
healthcare infrastructure is still a challenge, although I know it's being worked on in India.
Yeah, and then the deregulation. I mean, I think people are underestimating the amount of regulatory cholesterol that has been drained out in the last few years. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we are a much better and easier place to do business than we were till very recently. So all of these things put together, I think, mean that, ironically, even with inflation and other constraints, with the one exception of this imported inflation problem, India's economy is actually in rude health. Our banking system is in good shape after many years. There's an entrepreneurial explosion. There are some parts of our economy that are just booming, like technology and so on. And so I think, if this one awkward problem of high oil prices is removed, the Indian economy can easily grow at well over 8%.
Interesting. All right, some good predictions there.
Bruce Forsyth, the very famous UK game show host, used to say, "Didn't they do well?"
Didn't they do well?
Didn't they do well? Big round of applause.
Big round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Stay with us, the audience, because we'll be back in just a minute. In fact, we won't be back.
Yes,
for the
we're having a
first
little rest.
time. We're having a small rest,
Yeah.
but surviving to thriving with Arianna Huffington coming right up.
Yeah. See you in a second.